Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today, we're animating the first half of Chapter 38, Challenges to the Post-War Order. Or, if you're using the 15th or older edition, Chapter 39, The Stalemated 70s, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, start us off.
Gladly. The 1970s were truly a time of stalemate, as the previously rising standard of living flatlined and median worker wages stagnated. There were several causes of the stalemate in productivity. 1. There were more women and teenagers in the workforce instead of skilled male workers. 2. There was a shift from manufacturing to a service-based economy. 3. The Vietnam War, which sucked away tax money from education and science and also caused inflation. And 4. New Japanese and German factories with the most up-to-date technology that dominated steel and electronic industries. Now, Frank, could you tell me about Nixon's stance on the Vietnam War?
Absolutely. Nixon urged compromise between the American left and the American right. And this was personified in his policy of Vietnamization, in which America intensified its aerial bombing against North Vietnam while simultaneously withdrawing ground troops. Unfortunately for Nixon, this policy made him equally unpopular among war hawk Republicans who wanted to send more troops and anti-war Democrats who wanted to stop the bombing. On the whole, however, the majority of Americans, those who were not on the far right or left, agreed with Nixon policies. And this middle ground of American society was known as the silent majority. This was undermined by the ever-increasing opposition to the war as time went by, especially in the wake of the Lai Massacre, in which American troops massacred civilians at the Vietnam village of My Lai, and the expansion of the war to include Cambodia, which Nixon did in the years to come, also brought increased criticism of America's military activities in Southeast Asia. Abe, how was Nixon's expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia received by the American public?
Well, Nixon did order American troops to invade Cambodia, and the American public responded with a riot at Kent State University. The National Guard killed 4 students and wounded many others. So Nixon recalled the troops in Cambodia after a short 2 months. The American youth was pleased when draft calls were reduced and when the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. The anti-war protesters were further inflamed when the Pentagon Papers were published, and they described the government's blunders and lies during the presidencies of Kennedy and Johnson. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the policy of Detente?
Of course. One successful aspect of Nixon's foreign policy was his relationship with China. Under the advice of Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, Nixon began to culture closer relations with the world's most populous country. This increased closeness between China and the U.S. led the U.S.S.R. to pursue more diplomacy with the U.S., since it didn't want to be left out of a China-U.S. alliance. Now, this began to be known as Detente, which was a cooling of relationships between the U.S.S.R. and the Soviet Union, and it manifested itself in the new treaties between the US and Soviet Unions, as exemplified by the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. Abe, I'm getting kind of bored about learning about Nixon. What was the Supreme Court doing at this time?
Alright, let's change gears. Earl Warren took over the Supreme Court, and in his rulings, he demonstrated a powerful concern for the individual. For example, in Griswold v. Connecticut, the court invalidated a law that prohibited sexual contraceptives. The court also established a right of privacy that later safeguarded women's abortion rights. And in the case Miranda, the court ruled that all police officers had to read the Miranda Warning to all suspects. Many social conservatives cried, "Impeach Earl Warren!" And there were several vacancies on the court at this time. So Nixon chose to appoint people who promised to interpret the Constitution strictly, a Jeffersonian style. And Nixon appointed people who pledged to stop meddling in political and social affairs. Warren Burger was appointed Chief Justice, but he soon betrayed his promises of avoiding social issues with the Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion. Now, Frank, could you tell me what Nixon's domestic policies were?
Absolutely. Though a Republican, Nixon oversaw an expansion of welfare programs and championed legislation for minorities, such as seen in his Philadelphia plan, where he created affirmative action legislation for labor unions. He also oversaw the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and EPA, and the First Earth Day, as well as the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. Nixon next moved to take the U.S. off the gold standard, which devalued the dollar but made the currency more internationally competitive. Though contrary to Republican values, these served as concessions to the liberals as part of his Southern strategy, or his plan to recapture the White House in 1973. Abe, tell me, who won the election of 1972?
Well, let's start with the background. Foreign policy was the chief issue in the election of 1972. Nixon had promised 4 years earlier to bring peace in Vietnam, but he never followed through. The fighting actually escalated in Vietnam under Nixon. Nonetheless, Nixon was nominated as the Republican candidate against the Democrat George McGovern, who promised to pull the troops out of Vietnam. Nixon crushed McGovern and won the election of 1972. Nixon then launched a bombing raid in North Vietnam to force the North Vietnamese to negotiate an end to war. A ceasefire agreement was finally signed on January 23, 1973. Now, Frank, could you tell me about Nixon's policies in Cambodia now that he moved out of Vietnam?
You know I can. In July of 1973, Americans discovered that their military had carried out thousands of bombings in Cambodia, even though President Nixon had sworn to respect Cambodian independence. Anger with the president led to the passage of the War Powers Act, which required the president to report any substantial military activity to Congress within 48 hours of it occurring, and it set a 60-day limit on those activities. Abe, can you tell me about foreign policy's development in the Middle East at this time?
Yes, Syria and Egypt attacked Israel, and America decided to send almost $2 billion worth of war materials to the Israelis. The Israelis were saved, but OPEC responded by enacting an embargo on oil against the US and to several European countries. The oil shortage spawned a huge recession in France, Britain, and America. So Congress approved the construction of a pipeline from Alaska and set the national speed limit at 55 miles per hour. Although OPEC eventually repealed the embargo, they quadrupled the price of oil and caused more inflation in America.
And Abe, OPEC is the organization for petroleum exporting countries made up mostly by Middle Eastern nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates.
That is correct. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the big scandal under Nixon?
Of course I can. On June 17th, 1972, 5 men working for Nixon were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel after an attempt to plant electronic bugs. This was just the tip of the iceberg as far as Nixon's crimes were concerned, as he was later indicted for forging documents, harassing his enemies using the IRA or Internal Revenue Association, burglary, and using the FBI and CIA to disguise what he was doing. As the investigation progressed, Nixon refused to hand over documents and tapes, eventually firing his own prosecutor, attorney general, and deputy attorney general. Eventually, however, tapes of Nixon in conversation with his chief aide, the smoking gun tapes, led to conclusive proofs that he had systematically broken the law to ensure his own personal political power. With the law closing in on all sides, Nixon resigned from office on August 8th, 1974.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
And comment down below if you have any questions. As always, we'll catch you guys next time.